I'm going to ask a couple questions, and then the group's going to chime in as they feel they want to. I should point out, of course, that the conversation is videotaped today, so all our portions of it may appear on the web at some point. If you have information that you don't want to have on the web, but you want to let us know, maybe talk to Matt about that afterwards.
Okay. Understood.
My first question, and it's just to try to get a sense of I think a lot of the decisions about the economy are based on where you feel the economy is today in fall 2010. So how would you describe the condition of the economy, the U.S. economy right now?
I would describe it as somewhere between bad and terrible. You know, we have, we're dramatically underperforming in terms of where the economy historically has been at this point in a cycle after a bad recession. So economic growth is very, very feeble. Job creation is essentially non-existent. I think there are some serious looming threats out there, and I think the economy is in a very bad way.
Do you see any encouraging signs at this particular point?
Well, I mean, you know, it doesn't appear that we have a net contraction in GDP, so, okay, in that sense, I suppose it could be worse. But that's pretty thin gruel, because what we don't have is anywhere near enough growth to generate the jobs to absorb the people who've lost their jobs, much less the new entrants in the workforce. So, you know, that's the critical hurdle we got to get over, enough economic growth to put people back to work.
The government expects that of the $700 billion allocated for the troubled asset relief program, it will get back all of, what, about $50 billion or less. Economists say it spared the nation from a second Great Depression. Yet your website says you oppose taxpayer finance bailouts.
Right. From
the very beginning. Will continue to oppose them.
Right.
What should the government's response have been at the tail end of the Bush administration?
And I think that's a great question. I don't think that the TARP saved us from another Great Depression. If you go back and you look at the history of the Great Depression, and one of the most, I think, authoritative accounts was written by Milton Friedman in 1963, I think it was. And the single biggest factor, there were many, the single biggest factor was a huge contraction in money supply. And to his credit, Ben Bernanke understood that history very well. There was no way he was going to let that happen. And I've argued from the beginning that given what was happening in our economy, without getting too deep into the details of a fractional reserve banking system, the fact is we needed that quantitative easing that they did. He did it. That was probably the single most important measure that was taken. There were other things that I supported. I thought it was right to open up the discount window to some of the non-bank financial institutions so that they would have access to credit at a time when they were fundamentally solvent, but they were faced with a liquidity crunch. And so by accessing that credit, by providing that credit, I think the Fed allowed essentially solvent institutions to stay alive. I think it also made sense to expand the FDIC guarantee on deposits. That probably, but certainly diminished the risk of a run on banks that could have led to a collapse of banks. And I agreed all along that that was appropriate. It was when they crossed the line into this realm of this TARP, $700 billion, which, remember, it was sold initially by the Bush administration. And I criticized it and I opposed it when President Bush proposed it. But it was sold as a measure that was going to buy up the toxic assets from bank balance sheets. That was what it was meant to do. It was a very short bill, but it was huge in dollars. They said the world would come to an end if they didn't buy up these toxic assets. They got their bill. For a couple of weeks, did absolutely nothing. And then they gave up the plan to buy toxic assets. And they never did do that. What they did instead was they injected this money into a lot of big banks. First, it was a round of big banks. Then it was broadened to other banks, including banks that had no need and no interest in taking that capital, but they forced it on them anyway. So here's what I think the big thing that was clearly missing, and this is what I think is so unfortunate, it was a missed opportunity in the Financial Regulatory Reform Bill, what the whole experience revealed, among other things, one big thing was that we didn't have an adequate resolution mechanism for the failure of a very large financial institution. That was what was clear. And that's why Hank Paulson and Ben Bernanke got up every day and decided something different for the next firm that they were worried about. That's what happened, right? Bear Stearns was forced into a sale at a price way below what the market thought it was worth. In fact, the buyer ended up agreeing to pay a whole lot more after, they were forced into the sale. Lehman Brothers was allowed to fail. B of A was, Merrill Lynch was pushed into B of A. So you had this ad hoc policy, and that's a terrible idea. That has a chilling effect on the financial markets and credit, because everyone sits around the table and says, who knows what Hank Paulson and Ben Bernanke are going to decide to do next? We don't have a set of rules. We don't have a set of a legal framework by which people are operating. So my proposed solution is to make amendments to the bankruptcy code so that we can know in advance exactly how we would resolve the failure of a big financial institution in a rules-based, legally defined process, so creditors know what their risk is, investors know what their risk is, and we could do it quickly enough so that it wouldn't have the long, drawn-out, and potentially knock-on effects that everybody worried so much about.
In the atmosphere in Washington, D.C. at that time, I mean, a lot of people were saying we must, I think there was fear.
Mm-hmm.
People on the Hill were saying we have to do something, we have to do something. Would you have had alternate proposals?
Well, as I'm saying, they did a lot of things, many of which I thought were appropriate. I just had to draw the line on that TARP, and I really think that was a mistake. And by the way, the reference to the amount of money getting paid back, of course, does not include other categories. Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac have absorbed $148 billion of taxpayer money, and nobody has any prospects for any of that coming back. In fact, in all likelihood, they're going to want more money very soon, and they're going to get it. So it's a selective view of repayments when we look at just those $700 billion.
I'm going to ask you a question that came via a letter to the editor today. This person identifies themselves as a student at Wilkes University. She says, while browsing the job market, I'm beginning to feel I'm being forced to move out of state for any professional position. How do the candidates plan on developing professional job growth in Pennsylvania? And I think the key there being professional job growth. That's probably not a Marcellus Shale job that you're looking for.
Yeah, although
there are some.
Yeah, absolutely. And there are also related industries that need proximity to natural gas because of their business model, and so those will have. So you've probably seen the Penn State study that estimates that over the next 10 years, the direct and the indirect industries surrounding the development of natural gas could result in 250,000 new jobs. A lot of those will be professional jobs. Not all of them. It'll be a good mix, actually. It'll be a lot of opportunities for blue-collar workers as well as white-collar workers. There's another whole sector of our economy that I'm very bullish on for Pennsylvania, and I think it's something that needs a champion in Washington, and I would look forward, and that is the whole life sciences. It's pharmaceuticals, it's medical devices, it's tremendous innovation that's happening in various places throughout Pennsylvania. That it's wonderful innovation that is creating life-saving new techniques, medicines, devices. Pennsylvania is one of the leading states in America, and America is the leading country in the world in this field. I think the medical device tax that was just put in the healthcare bill is a very bad idea, and it's going to have a very negative impact on this sector. But they've got other issues as well. They need to have an FDA that is a little bit more predictable in the process they use when they're evaluating new devices and new drugs. The FDA should impose a rigorous process, but one of the criticisms I hear very frequently is that it's an unpredictable process, and they can go for months on end and get no response as to what's the holdup, what do we need to do next, where do we stand. So I think there are things, that's just one example. There's issues of international intellectual property rights that are not being adhered to. That's very much detrimental for the sector. But it's an example of a sector that I am very, very bullish on, and I think with the right policies in Washington, it can be a great growth industry for Pennsylvania. It is really mostly professional opportunities for folks across a wide range of disciplines, and as I say, I think the U.S. Senator from Pennsylvania ought to be a champion for this sector.
You bring up healthcare. Let's jump there next. I had a college roommate, pretty smart guy, who once said, once you give the people something, you can't take it back. Yet you're calling for the repeal of the Healthcare Reform Act. How are you going to talk to those 32 million formerly uninsured? And, I mean, before we talk about the perhaps flaws of the act itself, let's just talk about potential consequences, social consequences of trying to do something like that.
Well, I think 32 million is one of the numbers that's been bandied about. 47 million is another number that we've seen at times. We've seen a lot of different numbers, and I don't think those numbers really reflect the much smaller number of people who actually do have a chronic difficulty of obtaining health insurance and want to have health insurance. That's a much, much smaller number. I've always felt we should really zero in on policies to help those folks and not turn the entire system upside down. And in any case, with any kind of repeal, I have always insisted that we replace it with another set of reforms that will do exactly what you're referring to. It's got to improve access, it's got to improve affordability, and I think we can do that. Now, I will acknowledge that once you pass a big sweeping bill, a lot of people, once it becomes law, people start complying with the law, obviously. And so healthcare providers are developing processes and systems and practices that enable them to be in compliance. Hospitals and doctors and insurers. So we have to be thoughtful and careful about how we do this, because I don't want it to be even more disruptive than this bill has been. But I do believe it's fundamentally the wrong direction. It's the wrong approach. I've heard from I can't tell you how many doctors who believe, and these are smart people who've looked at this and thought about this, and they believe that their ability to exercise their own discretion and judgment in treating their patients is going to be constrained by government policies, and they're very worried about it. I think that's why the biggest Doctors Association in Pennsylvania is supporting me in this race. That's just one of the many problems with the bill.
Questions from the group? Do other people want to jump in?
Yeah, I have a question for you. Last decade or so, it seems as though Washington has become increasingly polarized, and it seems as though Congress has lost sort of sight of the art of compromising. What would your comment be on that going forward?
I think there's a lot of truth to that, and it's a problem. And you know, it doesn't have to be this way. There are examples that suggest that we can find common ground, even sometimes among people who really don't get along terribly well. An example that comes to my mind is the Republican-controlled Congress and with Bill Clinton in the White House after the '94 elections. They famously didn't get along, right? But look what was accomplished. Whether they liked each other or not, there was some new budget discipline that helped lead to a balanced budget. There were lowering of capital gains taxes that really, I think, helped encourage economic growth. There was welfare reform, which I think was very constructive. We had strong economic growth, and generally, for a while, there's some pretty sound fiscal policies. So you don't have to go terribly far back to find an occasion where there were the kind of compromises, there was cooperation. Let me just also suggest that I think my record when I was in the House and some of the things I've talked about on this campaign demonstrate my commitment to reaching out and working cooperatively with people on the other side of the aisle whenever I can. Excuse me, when I was in the House, for instance, I worked very closely with Shelley Berkeley, liberal Democrat from Nevada, on a bill that was important to both of us. It was a bill that would help doctors comply with new CMS regulations, and we worked long and hard together on that and eventually got it passed. I worked with Paul Kanjorski on issues that affected hospitals in both of our respective districts. Worked with Barney Frank on, we disagree on a lot of things, but we agreed that our NATO allies weren't carrying their fair share of the defense burden financially, especially as it related to Kosovo. And we tried to